Hello and welcome to my Core Set 2019 set review. Today I'm going to be going through every single card in Core Set 2019 and talking about the card a little bit, when you should be picking it in the draft, and how I think the card is going to perform in the limited environment. Importantly, I am not going to be giving the card a letter grade or a grade on a scale of 1 to 10 because I think that is a bit counterproductive, because a lot of the cards are in the same range. Like, there's a lot of C level cards, there's a lot of C plus cards, there's a lot of B minuses. So if all the cards are in that range, then it's really hard to provide nuance while still going through every card rather briefly, because I do want the set review to be a little bit shorter than a lot of the other ones, because I want you to be able to watch it as a bit of a pre-release primer or a video you can watch before your first draft video. So I'm just going to be going over the cards very generally, but I am going to be talking about when you should be taking them and the like. However, if you do want me to go into more detail on any specific card, if you have any questions about it, be sure to leave that in the comment section down below, and I will happily respond and go into more depth. I just want to keep the video a bit more concise. And as always, if you enjoy the video, be sure to click that thumbs up and subscribe to get updates for whenever I post new content. But without further ado, let's get to the set review. Okie doke. So we are going to start with white, and our first card is Aegis of the Heavens. I think this card is going to be a low priority combat trick. I don't think you need to pick this card up. You're not going to be super happy if you have to play this card, because it doesn't buff the power of the creature a lot, so it's going to be hard for you to make a creature trade up super high. Like, your 3-drop's not going to be trading up for their 6-drop a lot of the time or anything like that. So Aegis of the Heavens is going to be a very low priority. You don't need to pick this highly, and I don't think it's going to be very good. Aether Shield Artificer is a card that would be good in a lot of sets. Giving artifact creatures buffs when they're going to combat, especially Indestructible, is great. But in this set, there's only 3 artifact creatures at the common level, and 2 of them are kind of bad. And then there's only 1 common in blue that makes an artifact creature a Thopter. So Aether Shield Artificer is the type of card that you won't pick early. You'll take it later when you're already in an archetype that cares about artifacts, but then it's going to be pretty good. Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants, is going to be a good card. Planeswalkers are generally very good in limited, and when you do take this card, you're going to take it early, and then you're going to try and prioritize early drops, so you can go 2-drop, 3-drop Ajani, because that's going to be the best play pattern for this card. Ajani's Last Stand is an interesting card. It is not going to be like as good as a 4-mana 4/4 flyer would be, but it is going to be kind of close, especially if you're a defensive deck that wants to be blocking. However, if you're an aggressive deck where your opponent's not going to be able to kill your creatures, then it's not going to be as good. But if you can force them to block, it's still going to be able to make a 4/4. So I would treat it as a little bit less, like maybe a 5-mana 4/4 flyer, like treat it as you would treat that. It's still going to be very good. I think you're still going to take it very highly. Ajani's Pridemate is one of the build-around cards from the set. There is quite a bit of incidental life gain, like life gain stable on the cards that are already going to be pretty fine. So I think this card is going to be good. I think you should take it early and then prioritize the life gain a little bit higher than you normally would, but I think it's going to be good even if you don't work on prioritizing stuff, just because there is some incidental life gain in a lot of cards, and also it's going to be better in black-white than in any other archetype, I think. Ajani's Welcome is going to be unplayable. It just doesn't do enough to justify being on a card. Angel of Dawn, I think, is going to be a great card. I have it as the number 3 white common, because in a defensive deck, you play this on turn 5, and you can attack with your kind of defensive creatures because you're giving them vigilance. And in an aggressive deck, it's a great curve topper because you're giving all your guys vigilance. So I think this card is good in an aggressive deck and a controlling deck, and that's one of the reasons I have it very highly rated. I also think that if you have this card in your deck, you should make sure that you don't just trade off creatures willy-nilly and just try to use them when you can play your Angel of Dawn. Next up, we have Cavalry Drillmaster. I think this card is good, but I think it's going to be less good than people think it is, because it's not really a conventional 2-drop, because a 2-mana 2/1 is quite bad, and you don't get any value out of the Enters the Battlefield trigger if you play it on turn 2. So it's kind of like a split card in that way, because when you're playing it on turn 2, it's a 2/1, and when you're playing it later on in the game, the 2/1 body is not incredibly relevant. So I think the card's going to be good, but I think that you only really want it if you can make use of both halves. So if you want to be playing a 2-drop on turn 2 every single game, so you're an aggressive deck, and then you need ways to force through damage, then you'll care about the first strike. I don't think you necessarily want this card in a control deck, for instance, because, I mean, it's still going to be fine, but it's not going to be as good. Next up, we have Cleansing Nova. Obviously, this card's going to be great. You should take it early, and then you can draft a control deck because you know you have a sweeper to catch up if you fall behind. Daybreak Chaplain, I think, is going to be kind of bad. Just 2-mana 1/3s are not great. The incidental life gain is here, though, so if you have a couple of Ajani's Pridemates, I could see running one of these. It's much better in a control deck than an aggressive deck, because an aggressive deck doesn't really care about the lifelink as much, and 1/3s are pretty bad at beating down. I just don't think this card's going to be a high priority. You'll probably get it towards the end of a draft, and then you're not going to be super happy if it has to make your deck. Kind of similar camp on the Dwarven Priest. 4-mana 2/4 is just an unacceptable body in limited. gets outclassed by pretty much everything else that costs 4 mana. Even though you can gain some life, it's not going to make up for the fact that your creature is horribly understated. And I don't think this card's going to be a high priority. Again, you'll probably get it towards the end of the pack and be very unhappy if you have to, kind of unhappy if you have to put it in your deck. Next up, we have Gallant Cavalry, which is a card I want to talk about a little bit. I think it's one of 2 commons that makes 2 creatures. I mean, there's 3 commons that make 2 creatures for only 1 card. There's Gallant Cavalry. Then there is the Pioneer card in blue. It's I forget exactly what it's called, but it makes a Thopter. And then there is a Goblin in red that makes 2 1/1s. And I think that Gallant Cavalry is going to be one of the better. It's going to be a good card in this set because of there are a lot of mass pump spells, specifically in red and white. So I think that's going to be an archetype that you can draft, and it's going to be pretty good. But you have to prioritize Gallant Cavalry if you're going to do it. Gallant Cavalry is also a pretty good blocker. So I think you will take this card in the middle of the pack, but if you are trying to draft an Inspired Charge deck, then you will take it a little bit higher, and I'll talk about the deck a little bit more when I get to the Inspired Charge. Next up, we have Herald of Faith. This card's going to be good. You want to take this very early because it's pretty much impossible to race this card, and it's just very 4 powered flyers for 5 mana are very good. So you take this early and play it in every deck. Hieromancer's Cage is just efficient removal. You'll take it early, you'll play it, you'll be happy with it. Inspired Charge is a card I want to talk about. I think you can't just put this into any deck, but if you build your deck around it, it's going to be quite good. So you do want to prioritize cards like Gallant Cavalry. Also, the 2 mana 2/1 that gives First Strike is good with this type of card because the 2/1 body is not incredibly relevant later, but if you have Inspired Charge, it can just be sitting on the battlefield, and then it'll still be relevant later on because of your Inspired Charge. So I think Inspired Charge is the type of card that most decks don't want it, but if you do want it, you're going to take it. You're going to prioritize this card. So you probably won't prioritize it in pack 1, but in pack 2 and 3, if you are in that archetype, you'll take Inspired Charge quite highly, I think. Invoke the Divine is going to be a sideboard card, but it's a pretty good sideboard card. You ideally want them to have 3 targets before you bring in 3 good targets. Isolate's unplayable in limited. Knight of the Tusk, I'm pretty sure, is unplayable in limited. 6 mana, 3/7. It has a ton of toughness, but only 3 power on your 6-drop is not where you want to be. It's just very bad stats. Knight's Pledge is the type of card that I don't think is going to be good. It's just an aura that doesn't give you any lasting value if your creature immediately dies. So I don't think it's going to be worth a card because there is a decent amount of removal in the set and you can get blown out. It's got the classic aura downside. So I don't think you're going to want to play Knight's Pledge. Even if you lose to the card, don't be too results oriented. Just make sure that there are definitely formats where this card would be potentially good, but I don't think that I would start out playing this card. Knightly Valor is a card that I would start out playing. It's a mid-level. You can prioritize this in the middle of the pack. It's a fine card. It makes your creature pretty good, and it leaves behind a 2/2 Knight. Just make sure you don't get blown out. But if they're holding up mana, you don't necessarily want to go for the Knightly Valor. It does make your creature kind of a monster on offense and defense, but if you have your creature die, then you're left with it 2/2, which isn't horrible, but it's still leaves you open to blowouts if you cast this into open mana. Lena, Selfless Champion, is going to be a pretty strong rare. If you have this card in your deck, just make sure you don't attack and make trades if you don't have to, and you don't have a reason for it. But Lena is going to be a high pick, I think. At 6, it does justify its mana cost. And so you'll take it early on in the draft. Leonin Vanguard is the type of card I think that you will get very late in packs because most decks don't really want it. A control deck never really wants this card because they're not curving out. There are some aggressive decks that will want Leonin Vanguard, but they can probably pick it up. You don't really need to prioritize this card because it's only really great if you go turn 1 Leonin Vanguard, turn 2 2-drop, and then turn 3 3-drop, and then you're attacking for 2 on turn 3, which is pretty good, but that's not going to happen all the time. And later in the game, it does gain you some life, but aggro decks don't necessarily really care about that all that much. It is a kind of combo with the Pride Mate, but I don't think you really will necessarily want to play this card in most of your decks, so you can probably pick it up later in drafts. Leonin War Leader, however, is a card that you will want to play in every single deck you have. I would take this very highly. I think it's better than probably all the uncommons and commons, so I think you'll take this card highly, played in every deck, and it is a very strong rare. Loxodon Linebreaker is the definition of filler. It's just a mediocre card. You'll play it. You'll pick it up at the end of the pack. You'll play it sometimes, and it's going to be just decent, not great. Luminous Bonds I have as the #1 white common because it can play offense and defense quite well. You can get rid of a blocker. You can get rid of attackers. It's just very efficient removal, and I think you will take it highly and play it often. Make a Stand is a card that will start off decent in the format because you can blow people out with this, but as the format goes on and you start making crazy attacks, people are going to play around this card, and it's not going to be as good. So I think Make a Stand is going to start out a card that you can take in the middle to middle or to high part of a pack, and then by the end of the format, it's going to go down to the point where you're not really going to want this card all that often. You're not going to prioritize the card. You'll get it towards the end of the pack. Mentor of the Meek is a good card. I think you want to build your deck around it, and I would be happy to first pick this card. Mighty Leap is a good combat trick. It helps you force through damage, and it buffs the stats in a meaningful way. Important to note, all of the combat tricks in this set cost 2 mana, so if they're holding up 1 white mana, you don't really need to be afraid of anything. So yeah, Mighty Leap's a card that you don't really have to prioritize combat tricks because most decks don't want them, but like a lot of decks don't really want them, but if you want a Mighty Leap, you can get one and it'll be pretty good in your deck. Militia Bugler, 3 mana, 2/3 Vigilance is a decent card. Like not great, but it's decent. And then stabling on the fact that it can draw you a card some percentage of the time is pretty good. So I think this card's going to be a pretty high pick. Novice Knight is a card that it looks like, because of its ability, that aggressive deck would want it, because like you can imagine going this guy into the aura that gives +2/+2 and that being pretty good. But Novice Knight is really only a card that I would be happy to play in a control deck, because you can play it on turn 1 and then block like their 2-drops with it. So in that way, it's a pretty good blocker. Even if you play it on turn 2, it's still great. I don't think it's going to be worth running bad equipment and bad auras to justify playing this in an aggressive deck. So I think it's going to be pretty bad in aggressive decks and pretty great in control decks. Next up, we have Oresco Swiftclaw. There are some 1/1 tokens running around, so I don't think this is going to be super great necessarily, but it is a 2-drop that's got high power, so if your opponent stumbles a bit, you can run them over. It also is a pretty good blocker a lot of the time. It can block like 4-drops and stuff, so Swiftclaw is the type of card that's going to be like, you don't need to prioritize it, but you'll probably play it a decent amount. Pegasus Courser, however, I have as the number 4 white common. I think this card is quite good in an aggressive strategy, because you can play your 2-drop, and then even when they would normally be brickballing your 2-drop by their 3-drop or their 2-drop, you can start flying over with it, so you can get through extra damage. So you don't really want to be trading off your creatures if you're an aggressive deck and you have Pegasus Courser, because you want to be able to use the value and give your creatures flying. Remorseful Cleric is going to be a good card. 2 mana, 2/1 flyer is just great. The graveyard ability is not relevant, but this card's going to be good. I think you'll take it highly. Resplendent Angel is just a bomb. You're going to play it in every white deck, and it's going to be great. So I would take that very, very highly. Revitalize is the type of card that you won't play in almost every single one of your drafts, because it just, you might think, oh, it draws you a card, but it's very marginal upside on a card that like just kind of spins your wheels. 2 mana to draw a card and gain 3 life is just not worth it, because it puts you so far behind on tempo. Even if I had a couple of Johnny's Pridemates, I probably wouldn't play this card. Rustwing Falcon I don't think is going to be very good. 1/1s for 1 aren't generally not very good, even if they have like an evasive ability. And this being a 1/2 doesn't really change that all that much. It's just, these cards are so bad anytime except turn 1 that I don't think you really want this in your deck. And I don't think you need to prioritize it even if you do want it in your deck. Shieldmare, on the other hand, is going to be great. 3 mana, 2/3 that gains you 3 life when it comes into play is a good card. And then it has Rhino upside against red decks. So I think you're going to take this card pretty highly. Not over like good removal, but you'll take it over a lot of the medium creatures in white. Starcrown Stag I have as the number 5 white common. It's a good card if you're playing the beatdown role, because you can tap down their blocker that could block the stag and then get in with all of your smaller creatures as well. And it just really punishes opponents if they don't have a creature every turn of the game to like kind of counter your curve out. It's also really good when you combine with removal, but it is really only a beatdown card, so you don't really want it if you're playing a more controlling white strategy. So I would take this card pretty highly and then try to draft an assertive deck. Sun Cleanser, on the other hand, is the type of card that aggressive white decks don't want, and you'll probably be able to get it pretty late, because if you're controlling white deck, it's good, but the abilities are pretty irrelevant, and 2 mana 1/4 is even not even insane, so you'll probably be able to get it if you want it. I don't think you need to prioritize it at all. Take Vengeance is a good removal spell. I have it as the number 2 white common. It's way better if you're a control deck than an aggressive deck, because you can't kill blockers with it. So keep that in mind. It's going to be very good in control decks, good in mid-range decks, and pretty bad in aggressive decks. So if you're a super aggressive deck, I would probably take I would definitely rather have like a Pegasus Courser than take Vengeance in a super aggressive deck. Though keep in mind that in Limited, your decks are usually some shade of mid-range. Like you're never like a hyper aggro deck with like 10 1-drops or anything like that. So you're going to be playing Take Vengeance in pretty much every single one of your decks, because sometimes you stumble, your opponent gets ahead, and you'll just want to take Vengeance. I mean, you don't prioritize it as much if you are an aggressive deck. Trusty Pack Beast is going to be like fine. There's like a couple artifact creatures that could like die, but it's not going to be, and then you could get them back and get them value. But Trusty Pack Beast is just not going to be insane. you'll probably just pick it up towards the end of the pack, and it'll be like a filler card. You don't really want to play it in most decks. Valiant Knight, I think, is going to be pretty good. There are some knights, like the 4-drop that makes 2/2/2 knights, and this is going to be good if you. And then this is going to be good if you have some of those, and you can prioritize those higher if you have Valiant Knight. I think you're going to take Valiant Knight pretty highly. I think I would start out taking it over Luminous Bonds because being able to activate and pump itself is pretty good because then it can hit for 6. It's also a threat of activation type thing, and it does help all your other knights. So if you see it early, then you can prioritize the cards that make knights, though there aren't a ton of those. Okay, so that is going to do it for white. Now we're going to move on to blue. First up, we have Ether Tunnel. I don't think this card's going to be very good. It does give your creature unblockability, but it doesn't pump the power by all that much. So I don't really see where you're going to want to play this because, like, if you play it on a 3-powered creature, it does make it a 4-powered creature and unblockable, but you aren't really affecting the board, so you're going to like fall behind a little bit, and then they'll just be able to start hitting you and with their creatures. And it like really opens you up for a 2-for-1 without a ton of upside. So I don't think Ether Tunnel is going to be very good. Anticipate is a classic spin your wheels type card. I don't think you'll really ever want to play this card in Limited, just because most of the time you're just not going to be able to spend 2 mana to do nothing to affect the board. And usually you won't have a card that's strong enough to justify digging for it. Though if you have like some absurd bomb rare, I could see running an Anticipate to try and find it easier. Even Wind Mage is a card that I think is going to be pretty good. It has pseudo threat of activation, whereas you can like attack them for 2, and then if they do have like a 2/2 flyer, it's kind of risky for them to block, because if you have a spell, then you kind of blow them out. So I think Aven Wind Mage is going to be pretty good in the format, and you'll take it like a little bit higher than the middle of the pack. Like you'll take it in the first, like you'll take it like 5th or something like that, probably a lot of the time. That's my guess, at least. Next up, we have Aviation Pioneer, and I was initially like thinking about this card, and I was like, it doesn't like it's only a 1/2 with a 1/1, but that's still 2/3 worth of stats over 2 bodies. And then I think that the Thopter creature token is going to be pretty relevant because blue and white have blue has some minor artifact synergies, and I think that, and then there's an uncommon that cares about artifacts, and the white card that I went over earlier that cares about artifact creatures. So having like this is like the only card that makes an artifact in blue. So I think this card's going to be a pretty high pickup. Also, like 2/3 over 2 bodies is pretty good, and one of them has evasion. So I think Aviation Pioneer is going to be a card that you take pretty early. It's also good because it like can make 2 jump blockers if you need that. Bone to Ash, I don't think is going to be very good. It is just too expensive. So if you hold up 4 mana and your opponent is smart enough to play around like a Bone to Ash, they could play like a low priority creature. So like on turn 4, you hold up 4 mana, and then your opponent's like, okay, I'll just play my 2-drop. Like you can counter their 2-drop and get some value there, but you're not like countering anything great. And then like they can just slam their 5/5 the next turn, or they could just not cast anything if they're ahead on board, which they might be if you just hold up 4 mana every turn and never cast anything. So I don't think Bone to Ash is going to be a good card in the format. I just think it's too clunky and expensive. Cancel is just a classic sideboard card. You don't really want to main deck it because it's too slow, but if they have some unbeatable bomb and they're a slow deck, then you'll bring in Cancel. Departed Deckhand is going to be quite good. 2 mana 2/2, essentially unblockable, is just a very good body, and it can give your other stuff unblockable. So I think this is going to be a very high pick, and you'll take it early and play it every time. Disperse is going to be fine. You can usually find a way to get good value out of this type of card, but you don't really want like multiple, like you don't really want like 3 or 4 of these. Like you'll play 1 or 2, and it'll be pretty good, but you don't really want to take too many Disperses for your deck. So you don't really need to prioritize it as highly because you only really need 1. Divination is a card that I do want to talk about a little bit. It was quite good in Dominaria, but in general, this card is kind of slow and it's kind of clunky. So in Dominaria, it was good because the format was slow. In this format, I would start out with rating this card much lower than you would in Dominaria, just because it is a slow card and you do not want to fall too far behind on board by spending your turn 3 casting a draw 2 spell. So keep that in mind. I would not prioritize Divination, and I would really only ever run 1 copy in my decks, at least to start the format. And I would like not always even run 1. Gin of Wishes is going to be a great card. It's just a bomb rare. It's got a great ability, and it's just a 5 mana 4/4. So you take this early and play it every time. Dwindle I have as the number 1 blue common. It's just removal in blue because like the creature can chump block once, but -6 -0 takes care of most creatures, and it's like a 3 mana removal spell in blue. So I think it's going to be quite good. So yeah, I think you should take Dwindle early if you are playing a blue deck and play every copy of Dwindle you can get, I think. Essence Scatter is going to be good. The thing about Essence Scatter is it counters pretty much every relevant spell, and it trades up on mana a lot of the time, and it's pretty easy to hold up. So those things and the fact that it's good interaction for some problematic permanents makes Essence Scatter a good card to take. Exclusion Mage is basically Mana War 2.0. It's at the uncommon slot, and it importantly can't bounce your own creatures, but it's still going to be a great card. You'll take it early, play it every time, and it's going to be great. Frilled Sea Serpent is a nice little finisher for a blue deck because being unblockable is kind of nice. 6 toughness makes it hard to get through on the ground, but I don't think you need to prioritize it because it is really expensive and there's a lot of expensive win conditions you can already be playing. So I don't think you need to prioritize it. You'll probably get it towards the end of the pack. You'll play it sometimes. It'll be fine when you play it. Gearsmith Prodigy is a card that I think is unplayable. There's just not a ton of artifacts running around. In some formats, it would be like a 1-mana 2/2, but I don't think that's going to be the case in this format. Next up, we have Ghost Form, which I don't think is going to be playable. It just doesn't do enough to be worth a card. Your deck isn't going to be so aggressive that you're going to be wanting to give your creatures unblockable, though you'll probably lose to this card once and be like kind of annoyed by it. Horizon Scholar, it really showcases the power of Cloud Eater Sphinx because it gets 1 extra power for 1 extra mana compared to Cloud Eater Sphinx. Horizon Scholar is going to be fine. 6 mana 4/4 flyer is a fine body, and the Scry 2 is nice. I think you're going to take this card like in the middle of the pack though, because it is a 6-drop, which does make it kind of clunky. You're not going to take it over a lot of the most efficient cards like Dwindle. I think I'd probably start out with taking Essence Scatter over it, just because 6-drops are a liability. They're very hard to get to in Limited if you survive that long. Metamorphic Alteration is a kind of weird rare in that it doesn't actually like give you a creature. It just makes your creature into a copy of a creature. I think it's really hard to rate because you kind of have to have an expendable creature on the battlefield, and there has to be a good creature to copy. So I don't think it's going to be very playable. I think it's going to be kind of bad. But maybe you side it in if your opponent has a particularly bomb heavy, like top end heavy deck, and you have some like cheap creature token makers like the Aviation Pioneer. You could make that into like a 6/6 potentially. So I don't think you're going to main deck this card. I think it's going to be pretty bad. Mirror Image is the type of card that you have to build around. Entering the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control means that you have to have big creatures in your deck, and you have to be able to like survive long enough for you to be able to copy it. So you can't really treat it as a 3-drop because you don't really want to be copying a 2-drop with your 3-drop creature. So I don't think this card is great. I think it's kind of like too clunky, but I think you could play it if you were some deck that had a lot of top end and you wanted to be able to copy your finishers. And I think I'll definitely try the card out, but I don't think you want to start out prioritizing it super highly. Mistcaller is going to be unplayable. The ability isn't relevant, and it's just a 1-mana 1/1. Mystic Archaeologist is great. It's a 2-drop creature, so it can block early, and then it gives you like an easy way to win the game once you get up to 5 mana. So I think you're going to take it. Like I'd be pretty happy to first pick this card, and then you just prioritize controlling cards. Omen Speaker I have as the number 5 blue common. I think it's going to be pretty good because Scry 2 is similar to draw a card. Late in the game, you play this card and you scry away lands, and every land that you scry away is basically like drawing a card. And early on, it helps set you up for good future turns. So I think that Omen Speaker is going to be quite good. Also, I had Essence Scatter at the number 2 blue common, if I forgot to mention that. Omniscience is just way too expensive for Limited. It's unplayable. One with the Machine, there's just not enough artifacts for this card. I think it's also unplayable. Patient Rebuilding is a cool win condition. You don't have to do anything. You can just wait for this to mill them out, draw extra cards, control the game. I think Patient Rebuilding is going to be a build around card, but I think you can take this. You can definitely take this early and build a deck around controlling the game with it. Psychic Corrosion, on the other hand, it doesn't give you any way to help you control the game, so I think this card's going to be pretty bad. People love milling, but I think a lot of the time you're not going to be able to mill someone out with this card. You're just spending turn 3 doing nothing. And then if they're playing like any sort of aggressive deck or assertive deck, they're just going to kill you. Though you can side this in a control mirror. Psy Master Thopterist, there's not a ton of artifacts in this set that are playable, so I don't think Psy is going to be great. I think he's more of a constructed plant than anything, so I don't think you're really going to want to play Psy. Though if you can pick up a couple of if you pick up like 4 or 5 good artifacts, which there aren't a ton of, you could play Psy. I don't think it's going to happen though. Salvager of Secrets is a pretty decent value card, but it is only a 5-mana 2/2, so it's pretty bad if you're getting beaten down. So I don't think you're going to really want to prioritize Salvager of Secrets. You can probably get it towards the end of the pack if you want it, and then it'll be decent then. But most of the time, 5-mana 2/2, even if it does draw you a card, a spell is pretty weak. Weak in stats wise, so you're just not going to play it a ton. Scholar of Stars, 4 mana 3/2s is pretty bad rate. You're paying an extra mana essentially because 3 mana 3/2s like kind of like the going rate. Usually has 3 mana 3/2 with upside. 4 mana 3/2 if it draws you a card every time is pretty good, but as I said, there's not a ton of artifacts running around, so you're only going to play this if you have enough artifacts. And I think you'd only really want it if you had like 6 artifacts, and I don't think you're going to get there very often. Sift is good card advantage, but it is just still card draw, and we're unsure whether the format's going to be super aggro or not. So I would start off by not prioritizing Sift, but obviously like, Sift could be great if the format ends up slower. Skilled Animator, another artifact payoff card. I think you want like 6 artifacts before you play Skilled Animator, and even then, it's not going to be like it's going to be pretty good if you can get an artifact into play and then play Skilled Animator, but it's going to be hard to get the artifact, I think. So I don't think I'm going to prioritize Skilled Animator. I'm not going to take it highly. I would only take Skilled Animator once I had the artifacts. I wouldn't take Skilled Animator and then go for the artifacts. Same with all the artifact payoff cards. There's just not enough artifacts to be able to get there. Sleep is an interesting card. If you are an aggressive deck, Sleep is going to be great. It's pretty much just going to win you the game when you cast it if you have like any reasonable board state. But you don't want it in a control deck because they will untap their creatures eventually, and then you haven't affected the board by playing Sleep. Snapping Drake is a card that is good, I think. 4 mana 3/2 flyer. 3-powered flyers for 4 mana are generally pretty good, especially in aggressive decks. It's not a great blocker, but it is a very good attacker. So I think Snapping Drake is going to be pretty good. You don't need to prioritize it though. You can take it in the middle of the pack, and it'll be nobody else. Like it's not going to be the type of card that everyone's like snapping over. Like they're not fighting over the Snapping Drakes. It's just going to be a card you take in the middle of a pack. Supreme Phantom. There's not really a Spirit synergy deck in this format. There's more of a constructed plant, but 2 mana 1/3 flyer is fine. So I think you'll play this a decent amount of the time. You just don't need to prioritize it for your deck. You'll take it like middle of the pack. Surge Mayor is nice. 2 mana 0/5 is a great blocker, and then it has an activated ability, which makes it hard to deal with in combat because they don't really want to attack their 2/2s into it. You can just hold up the mana. And if you attack them with it, you can get in for 4, but they can't block it with their 2/2s. So I think Surge Mayor is going to be a high priority pickup if you are a heavy blue deck because it is double blue to cast. So you want to have like 9 islands. You want to have definitely more islands than your other color, and ideally like 10 islands in your deck. Switcheroo is a tough card to evaluate. I don't think it's going to be super great because I think that there's not a ton of there's not a ton of like 1/1s necessarily running around, though in some matchups it's going to look insane. I think you can definitely play this card, but I wouldn't like take it early and try to build around it because building your deck to have like a bunch of weak creatures is kind of weird, and yeah, then you're putting yourself in a spot where you don't want to block with your creatures because if you draw your Switcheroo, you want to trade your creatures. It's just kind of a weird card. Tezzeret Artificer Master is just a bomb rare. You take it every single time you see it pretty much and to just play it every time. The 0 to draw a card is good. You're probably not going to be drawing 2 cards a ton of the time, but also just it starts out with 5 loyalty and then you plus it, goes up to 6 loyalty, and you get a 1/1, and you're just going to get a 1/1 every turn. It's a very good card. Take it early, play it every time. Tolarian Scholar is a derpy little creature. It's fine. Probably not a high priority. You'll just get it towards the end of the pack and you'll sometimes play it. Without Wizard synergies, this card is definitely worth a lot less. So I don't think you're going to really want to play it. Totally Lost is fine interaction. Yeah, blue doesn't always get a ton of great interaction. So instant speed, putting something on top of their deck is kind of nice. It doesn't put you down a card. So I think Totally Lost is fine, but not insane because it is 5 mana. So you don't need to prioritize it. Uncomfortable Chill is going to be the type of card that you might get wrecked by like once. Like you attack all out, they Uncomfortable Chill you, and then you just lose all your creatures. So do be wary of Uncomfortable Chill, but if you play around it, it's not going to get you as badly. I do think the card's going to be good as the format starts, and then it's going to generally slowly go down in value, though I do think the card is going to be fine throughout the format, but just because it's a pretty powerful effect. It's also not just attacking creatures. In the past, this effect might have only affected attackers. You can sometimes also set up turns where you attack them with a bunch of creatures, and then you give their creatures -2, -0, and draw a card. So you attack them, they make their blocks, you make all their blockers irrelevant. Wall of Mist, I don't think it's going to be very good. It just doesn't have any power, so it can't trade with anything. So it's just not going to be a good card. You don't really want it. Windreader Sphinx, 7 drops are very expensive, so I'm going to start off with this card being kind of bad because it's a 7 mana 3/7 flyer, which is just not good stats even for a 7 drop, and it is 7 mana, so you're not going to live to get there a lot of the time. If the format ends up being slow, this card's going to be pretty good though, I think, just because it draws you a card every turn essentially, and it's kind of hard to kill. But yeah, that is going to do it for blue. Let us move on to the black cards. First up, we have Abnormal Endurance, another one of the 2-mana combat tricks I was talking about. This card's kind of, it can save your creature from removal. It can give your creature like a little bit of combat stats to trade with something. So I think this card's going to be fine. I remember when Supernatural Stamina was a combat trick, which was this exact card pretty much, except it cost 1 mana, and that card was quite good, especially in aggressive decks. But I think this card's just going to be fine because holding up 2 mana is kind of difficult, so you're not going to have to prioritize Abnormal Endurance. If you want one, you can probably end up with one. Blood Divination is a tough card to overrate. It is a tough card to rate just because it's hard to figure out if there's going to be expendable creatures. Also, this card is much worse if the format's quick because you're literally giving up board presence. You're not just taking a turn off developing your board, you're actually hurting your board state to just draw cards. So that's going to be a tough cookie to sell. I don't know how to. Yeah, it's tough to sell that if the format's quick. So Blood Divination, I'm going to start off low on Blood Divination and then move up as the format goes on if there are expendable creatures running around and the format's not as quick. But I think the format may just be a little bit too quick for this card to be good. So I'm going to start off with you don't need to prioritize this card and you shouldn't play it for starters. Bog Stomper, 6 mana, 6/5. It's just a big finisher. You don't need to prioritize this. You can usually get a better finisher than this. Sometimes you'll play the Bog Stomper though. Bone Dragon is a great rare. Exiling 7 other cards from your graveyard isn't usually that feasible in Limited, though it can happen very late into a game. So it is still a great upside on the card. And 5 mana, 5/4 flyer is just great. So Bone Dragon's the first pick. Play it every time you can. Child of Night, having 1 toughness is a bit of a liability because it trades with a couple of like smaller creatures. There are cards that make 1/1s in this format, and Child of Night just trades with those, but 2 mana, 2/1 lifelink is still a fine creature. I just don't think you need to prioritize it. You can usually probably get it a little bit later, and you'll be pretty happy to play it, especially if the decks are a bit more aggressive. Depending on how aggressive the format is, Child of Night will go up or down in value, but I think you'll start off just taking it middle of the pack, and it'll be fine. Death Baron is it's like a cool constructed card because you can build your deck filled with skeletons and zombies, and there are some skeletons and some zombies in this format. So I think Death Baron is going to be a build around card, but I think you can play it in most black decks because there are a decent number of zombies and skeletons to play with. So I think Death Baron is going to be pretty good, but you don't have to first pick it over great removal spells or anything. You can pick it pretty highly, but not super highly. Demon of Catastrophes is going to be great. 4 mana 6/6 is awesome, and it doesn't have a downside every turn like a lot of these demons do. A lot of them make you sacrifice a creature every turn. This one just makes you do it once, and then you get a 6/6 trample. So I think you'll take this early and play it every time. It's going to be great. Diagraph Ghoul, 1 mana 2/2 is going to be good. It is also a zombie, which is semi-relevant for that rare we just looked at. But I think 1 mana 2/2 is going to be pretty good in this format. Even if it does come in tapped, it's a fine aggressive card. Not as good in a defensive deck because it can't block the turn it comes into play. But I think Diagraph Ghoul is going to be good. You're going to probably take it in the middle of the pack, though. It's not going to be absurd. It's just going to be fine. Doomed Dissenter is going to be pretty good. I think I have it at the number 5 black common slot. The black commons are a little bit weak, in my opinion, but it's a 2 mana 1/1, so it can sometimes trade for things on the front half, and then it creates a 2/2 when it dies, so it's just a little bit of value. If you have any sacrifice cards in black, like the uncommon we looked at the beginning, then Doomed Dissenter is a nice pickup. It also can chump block and buy you time, so I think Doomed Dissenter is going to be a pretty good card. Duress is just a sideboard card for if they have a bomb, sorcery, or instant. Other than that, I don't think it's going to be main deckable. Epicure of Blood, 5 mana 4/4. The gain life text is not super relevant because you're not going to be gaining a ton of life in Limited necessarily. But 5 mana 4/4 is fine. I don't think you're going to prioritize this card. You'll get it towards the end of the pack and it'll be fine. But you're not going to really need to prioritize Epicure of Blood. Next up we have Fell Spectre, 4 mana 1/3. Enters the opponent battlefield, they discard a card. It's pretty good. It guarantees it gets some value. And then when they discard a card, they lose 2 life. So there's not really a discard deck. So it's essentially a 1/3 that they discard a card and lose 2 life, which is pretty good. It gets in for some guaranteed damage if you're an aggressive deck. Picks apart their hand, but it's not a great blocker. And if you're getting beaten down, then it's not going to help you a ton. I think it's going to be a middle of the pack type card. You're not going to prioritize it super highly. Unless the format's a bit slower, in which case them discarding a card is more relevant and you're not going to care about the card being a poor blocker. Fraying Omnipotence is a really powerful card. I I think it's much more of a control card than an aggro card. You can kind of set it up so that you have an even number of creatures and they have an odd number of creatures so that they'll sacrifice more stuff, but it's really hard to... And then you can also set it up so that you don't have to discard as many cards. I think it'll be a good card in aggressive decks. It's tough. It's like you have to be able to set up all of the effects, because in an aggressive deck you won't have any cards in hand, but you'll have more creatures. So I think Fraying Omnipotence is really hard to rate. But I think I'm going to start out by taking the card pretty highly and then trying to build my deck around it so that I can not have a ton of creatures necessarily when I play it, but not have to discard a ton either. I don't know. I'm going to start out taking it fairly early and trying to build around it, but I don't think the card is like I wouldn't start out like if you're in doubt, you can just take a good common over it and not worry that Fraying Omnipotence is secretly broken, because I don't think it's a broken card, but I think it's a card that if you build around it properly, which is very hard to do, then it could pay you off. But I'm going to start out, I think this card's a card that you don't need to prioritize early on in the format, and if it turns out to be good, then you'll have time to figure that out. Gravedigger is just a great value card. Take it early, play it every time. It's going to be great. And if you can get 2 Gravediggers, then you can set up the Gravedigger loop, and that's even better. Graveyard Marshal is just a great card. 2 mana, 3/2 is already good, and then its ability is awesome. So take Graveyard Marshal early, play it every time. Though you do want to prioritize black mana symbols a little bit, because it is double black to play. But you don't even have to play it on turn 2, so it's still good. Hired Blade is not great. 3 mana, 3/2. Flash is not a super relevant ability on this type of creature, because it'll still trade with whatever it's trying to ambush. So I don't think Hired Blade is going to be great. You'll probably get it towards the end of the pack. And play it some of the time. Infectious Horror, I think, is also quite bad. 4 mana, 2/2 is never going to be able to attack, so its text is pretty irrelevant. So I think its card's unplayable. Infernal Reckoning is also unplayable. There's not enough colorless creatures in Limited. Infernal Scarring is the type of card that's fine in an aggressive deck, but you really don't want to get blown out, so make sure they're tapped out when you play this card. And it'll be fine, especially if you put on something evasive, which black has some evasive creatures that you can put it on. And you don't really need to prioritize Infernal Scarring, though. You should pick like normal cards over it, like just good creatures and stuff over it, and then if you play Infernal Scarring, you play Infernal Scarring and it's fine. Next up we have Isareth the Awakener, which is a good card. It having Death Touch is a huge benefit because it means that it'll trade even if they do block it, and you do get back a creature. It's only from your graveyard, but so it can't like take back their huge creature, but it's still free value on the Isareth, and if Isareth can attack unopposed, then it's going to just win you the game. So I think you take Isareth highly and play it every time. Lich's Caress I have as the number 1 black common. 5 mana destroy creature is pretty clunky, but you do gain 3 life to kind of help make up for like the fact that you're waiting till turn 5 to cast this. I think the fact that this is the best black common is kind of scary for black, but it's just fine removal. If the format ends up slower, the card can be a little bit better. Next up we have Liliana, Untouched by Death. It's not a very great Planeswalker for Limited, just because unless you have a great lot of zombies, it's not going to do a ton. So I wouldn't start out by trying to play this card all that often. I think it's pretty unplayable in most decks. Liliana's Contract is the type of card that's great in a slow format and horrible if the format's fast. The second line of text is irrelevant in this format, but I think if the format's slow, you'll be able to play this card and it'll be good, but I think I'm going to start off with it being unplayable, just because paying 5 mana and dealing 4 damage to yourself is so bad against an aggro deck. You can side it in if you're playing a control mirror, but I'm going to start off by keeping it in the sideboard. Macabre Waltz is pretty bad as well. You may think, oh, I'm drawing 2 spells and discarding a land, but that's only in the very late game. Early on in the game, this card does literal nothing pretty much. Macabre Waltz is pretty unplayable. Mind Rod is a sideboard card against in a control mirror. In an aggressive matchup, you don't really want to spend 3 mana and not affect the board. Murder is premium removal. Take it early, play it every time. Nightmare's Thirst is kind of a build-around card. 1 mana to give a creature -1/-1 is not great, even if you do gain a life. But if you can build some life gain into your deck and kill something bigger, then Nightmare's Thirst becomes quite good. So I think it's more of a build-around card that you can pick up later in the draft when you already have some life gain cards, rather than like an early pick that you build around. But I think it could be powerful in the right deck. Open the Graves seems like a good card, but it is kind of slow because you're spending 5 mana and you have to have a board when you play it, so you're not like going to be able to trade off your creatures beforehand. I don't think it's going to be insane early in the, I don't think it's going to be an insane card because I think there's going to be at least a couple proactive decks, and then you have to start trading off your creatures to get 2/2s. So it's going to be like, it could be very good. Like, it has the potential to be very good. It has a strong effect, but I don't think it's going to be good. And like, I don't think it's going to be great, just because I think you're going to get run over if you just spend 5 mana to do this on your turn. Phylactery Leech is a card that seems insane, but then you realize that there are very few artifacts in the set. So if I had like 5 or 6 artifacts, I would consider playing Phylactery Leech, but since you literally can't play the card unless you have an artifact in play, I think Phylactery Leech is going to be generally unplayable in a lot of decks. Plague Mare is going to be good, though you can play around it by just not leaving your creatures on 1 toughness, and there's other reasons against black decks not to leave your creatures on 1 toughness post-combat. You can also play it pre-combat to enable better attacks. So I think Plague Mare is just going to be great, and unblockable by white is a nice upside. So I would take Plague Mare pretty early, and then I would play it in a lot of decks. This is a card that hoses 1 toughness creatures, though, so be aware that 1 toughness creatures aren't perfectly safe from the uncommon. So I think you take Plague Mare early and then play it every time. Ravenous Harpy is a card that's kind of tricky because usually sacrificing effects at instant speed are pretty good. So I'm going to start off with this card being fine, but it is a 3-mana 1/2. So you don't prioritize this card, but like in certain decks, I could see this card being like kind of nice. The problem being that a lot of the times, if you're getting beaten down, a 3-mana 1/2 doesn't help you a ton. So certain decks will want it, most decks won't. So I think the card's going to end up being not a high priority unless you'll know when you want it is what I mean. So I don't think you're going to really prioritize the card. I think you'll get it towards the end of the pack sometimes, play it sometimes, but then there will be certain decks where it's absurd. Reassembling Skeleton, 2-mana 1/1 is not great, but it can come back again and again. It's kind of a sweet combo with the Ravenous Harpy because you can play 3 mana to put a counter on the Harpy late in the game. But since it comes back tapped, you can't you can continually jump block something. So it's kind of tricky to rate these Skeleton because it's kind of annoying. But spending 2 mana to only bring a 1/1 back is not going to win you the game overall. So I think the card's going to start off I'm not going to prioritize this card early. I think it's going to be kind of bad, just because 2 mana 1/1 is pretty bad. And then spending 2 mana to bring it back is not necessarily great. It could be a little bit better depending on how the format pans out, but I think I'm going to start off by not prioritizing it, and it's going to be a card that you sometimes play, but you're not really happy to play. Rise from the Grave, 5 mana to bring back a creature is not super great, so I don't think you're going to need to prioritize this card, though. It'll be fine in some decks, especially if you have unconditional removal and your opponent has big creatures, but don't prioritize Rise from the Grave. You can pick it up. If you pick it up late in the draft and have to play it, it's fine, but don't prioritize it. Skeleton Archer I have as the number 4 black common. I think it's going to be pretty good, but it's going to go down in value as the format goes on because if you attack your 2/2 into their 3/3, they're just not going to block if you have if you're going to be playing a 4-drop in black because they'll just know the Skeleton Archer is coming. Though the threat of Skeleton Archer can lead to some sick bluffs, so keep that in mind. But don't bluff early on because people won't have gotten blown out by the Archer before. Also, this card makes 1 toughness creatures a lot worse, so I would take Skeleton Archer pretty highly and prioritize it because being able to ping things is pretty good, especially because the body's not embarrassing on its own. It can also ping your opponent, which is quite relevant. Skymarch Bloodletter I have as the number 3 black common. It's just a very 3-mana 2/2 that drains them for 1 is just great, and I think you're going to take it early, play it often, and be pretty happy with it. Sovereign's Bite is unplayable. It just doesn't do enough as a card. Stitcher's Supplier is also pretty unplayable. You're not going to have enough graveyard synergies unlimited for the 1-mana 1/1 to matter. Strangling Spores I have as the number 2 black common. It's kind of sad that I have this as the number 2 black common. I kind of wanted to put the Skymarch Bloodletter above it, but removal is removal. You can usually get decent creatures, but removal is hard to get sometimes. And 4 mana -3/-3 at instant speed is pretty bad, but not it's pretty bad by certain standards, but it is still removal. It can still kill a lot of creatures, and you can still get value out of it as a combat trick even. So I think it's going to be fine, and I think you're going to take it pretty highly and play every copy. Most of the copies you get, every copy you get, you'll put play, I think, but you won't get a ton of copies because it is removal, and removal is pretty premium. Two-Headed Zombie is a nice card. I like high power on menace creatures because when they double block it, you can sometimes kill both their creatures. But 4 mana 4/2 is a horrific blocker, so you only want it if you're an assertive deck, so I wouldn't prioritize the card. I'd take it later in a pack. Vampire Neonate, I don't think the card is great. 2 mana tap to ping is just too much, even if you do gain a life. So I don't think Vampire Neonate is going to be a high priority unless you have some life gain triggers that really, really matter. I don't think it's going to be a great card. I don't think you want to take this card and play it. Though in certain decks, in certain matches, I could definitely see siding it in and having it be great. Like against an aggressive deck with a lot of 2/2s, you can side this in and block all their guys and then gain some life if you have extra mana. And then the control mirror that's just going to stall out, you could ping them to death. But I think it's just kind of bad a lot of the time, so I don't think you're going to want to prioritize it. Vampire Sovereign is just great. 5 mana 3/4 that gains you 3 life and loses your opponent 3 life is just great in any deck. So take this card early, play it every time you can. Walking Corpse is a 2 mana 2/2. I mean, some formats 2 mana 2/2s are playable, sometimes they're not. I'm gonna start out with this card playable. You want a certain number of 2-drops in this format, but a lot of the time you're gonna just be fine leaving this card on the sidelines if you have better 2-drops. And that is going to do it for black. Let's move on to the red cards. First up, we have Active Treason. I'm going to start off with this card being pretty unplayable, unless your deck is super aggressive, and then you can sometimes use it as a finisher. But I'm going to start off with the card being unplayable, and then I'll move up on it if it seems good. Alpine Moon is unplayable because it just doesn't do anything in limited. Apex of Power is too expensive to do anything in limited, so it's horrible. Bane Fire, however, is going to be pretty good. X spells in limited are generally pretty fine, and being able to target a creature or a player is nice. And the not being able to be countered isn't really relevant in limited, but it's kind of nice upside in case they have like a cancel for it. They can't bring in cancel to stop it. I think Bane Fire is just going to be pretty good. Pretty good removal, and you'll take it early and play it every time you can. You could even splash this card. I think it's a good splash card. Boggart Brute is, I have it as the number 5 red common, which kind of says something about the red commons, but 3/2 Menace is a nice body for 3 mana, and I think that it's going to be pretty good in your aggressive decks, and it's not even horrible as a blocker. Catalyst Elemental I think is unplayable. 3 mana 2/2 is just bad, and then the sacrifice ability is not great because you're like, there's not really a card worth 2 for winning yourself just to add a couple mana for. Crash Through is a card that could see play marginally, like some decks want an instant or sorcery for their like Aven creature, the 3 mana 2/2 flyer. But there's Enigma Drake in this format, so sometimes you'll play Crash Through if you have a couple of those. But I don't think Crash Through is going to be played most of the time. It just doesn't do enough for a card. Even like it spins your wheels, even though it's only 1 mana to spin your wheels, it still spins your wheels and does nothing. I think Dark Dweller Oracle, it's just going to be fine. 2 mana 2/2 is already a fine body, and then it does have upside. You might think, but I sacrifice a creature, and then I might just get a land or something. And that is true, but it's all upside on a 2 mana 2/2, which is probably already playable in this format. It's a goblin, which could be relevant. Not really super relevant, but if you have like other bears, it might matter. And there's an uncommon, I think, that cares about goblins. But Dark Dweller Oracle is just like a card that I would take. I wouldn't take it like first pick or anything, I don't think. I think I would take it like pretty highly though, because it is just all upside. Like you can block sack, which is nice. Block sacking isn't great because you can only play the card if it's an instant. But it's just all upside. So I think it's going to be like a medium level pick. You don't like take it super highly, you don't take it super lowly, but Dark Dweller Oracle is just fine. Don't get too caught up in the text on these type of cards. It's still a 2 mana 2/2 at worst case. Demanding Dragon, 5 mana 5/5 flyer, same thing. It's still going to be great. It can also randomly deal 5 to the opponent, or make them sack a creature, both of which are good. And it's stable to a 5 mana 5/5. So the fact that you're giving them a choice, usually cards to give your opponents a choice are not great because you're giving them a choice, so they can choose whichever one, doesn't matter. Like in a Control Mirror, they'll just take 5, but in this case, you're getting a 5 mana 5/5, so it's still going to be great. So I think you take this card early, play it every time. Dismissive Pyromancer is going to be great. 2 mana 2/2 with all this great upside, so I think I would take this early and play it every time. It just is a great value card. It has a lot of versatility. Double Cast seems pretty unplayable to me. You're not going to have a ton of great instants and sorceries, and if you have a turn where you're spending like, you're playing Double Cast and then like another instant or sorcery, then that's expensive, then you're probably in a pretty good position anyway. So I don't think Double Cast is going to be playable. I think it's going to start off, I'm going to start off with it being unplayable and then move up on it if it ends up being playable. But I don't think it's going to be great to start, so I'm going to start off with it being an F or unplayable. I'm not giving grades, but I think this card's unplayable. I've said it a lot of times. Dragon Egg is the type of card that's good in a defensive deck because it gives you a free block and then it makes a creature, but like a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is, with that ability, is nice in an aggressive deck, but not great in a control deck. So it's kind of hard because if you're an aggressive deck, you don't want this card because it does nothing. And if you're a control deck, then like it gives you a free chump block. But yeah, I think the card's going to be pretty good in control decks and bad in aggressive decks. So I'm going to start off by taking it in the middle of a pack, though you can prioritize it if you're control deck a little bit higher, and then just not play it in your aggressive decks. Electrify I have as the number 2 red common, 4 mana, deal 4, instant speed, clean, efficient removal, or relatively efficient removal. Instant speed can give you some value. I think this card's going to be great. Take it early, play it every time. You can even splash this card and be pretty happy with it. Fiery Finish, 6 mana to deal 7 to target creature is very clunky. I don't think you need to prioritize this card a ton, but you will probably play like 1 copy in some of your decks. Just don't prioritize it. I'd definitely rather have Electrify than Fiery Finish. Fire Elemental is just a clunky creature. You can get it towards the end of the pack usually, and then you sometimes play it, but most of the time you won't. Just a 5 mana 5/4. Goblin Instigator, I think, is going to be a very good card. I have it as the number 3 red common, which may be surprising, but I think 2 bodies for 2 mana is really good in this format. Because there are some X1s running around, and also I think it's going to be a key part of an inspiring charge deck if that deck exists. There's also Trumpet Blast in this format, which I'll get to in a little bit, but Goblin Instigator is going to be a key part of the red-white go-wide deck, I think. So you're going to, especially if you're that deck, you're going to really want to prioritize the Goblin Instigator. Next up, we have Goblin Motivator. I remember when there was a card like this in Amonkhet. I forget exactly what it's called. It's just not coming to me right now, but it was like good. It was like good in Amonkhet in certain decks, but only in hyper aggressive decks. And we'll just have to see if there are hyper aggressive decks that want Goblin Motivator. My first thought is that it's unplayable, and then I'll move up on it if it turns out to be playable. But it's good to start with unplayable on these cards and move up rather than start with playable and move down. So start off by not playing this card, but if it ends up good, then you'll know because people will be playing it way too much. Because even if the card is playable, it's only playable in very certain archetypes. Goblin Trashmaster, 4-mana 3/3 that randomly hates on artifacts, which isn't super relevant because, as I've said a ton of times, there's not a ton of artifacts. But giving other goblins +1/+1 is nice because there's Goblin Instigator, there's Boggart Brute. So there are a decent number of goblins in the set. So I think this card's going to be a card that you take early and then you just prioritize some goblins. But because all the goblins are pretty good on their own. Next up we have Gutter Snipe. I think this card's going to be, it depends on if the archetype it's good in is good, because a 3-mana 2/2 is pretty bad. But if it can like ping the opponent a bit, it's going to be pretty good. So I think I'm going to start off with this card being like a mid-level pick. Like you could take this, you'll play it in a lot of your decks. Like if you have 5 or 6 instants, you'll probably play Gutter Snipe, just because that is some nice free damage. But it could definitely be bad, and it could definitely be better than that. So I'm going to start off with it being a medium card and then move up or down accordingly. Havoc Devils, 4-mana 4/3 trample is just a nice body. I'm going to start off with this card being a little bit better than an average card. I'd take it like medium in the draft, but I think this card's going to be nice. It is 4 mana, though, so you don't really need all that many 4-drops. Hostile Minotaur is next. 4 mana, 3/3 haste. 3/3 is a pretty big body, kind of hard to block, so you can definitely get in for hits with this on turn 4 still. So I think Hostile Minotaur is going to be pretty good in an aggressive deck. Not great in control decks, obviously, because you don't care about the haste and it's kind of underpowered, understated. But I think you'll be fine playing one of these. You don't really need to prioritize it, though. I think I'd rather have Havoc Devils a lot of the time for the extra power and the trample. And I think Hostile Minotaur is going to be you'll take it towards the end of the pack, like in the middle to late part of the pack, and like 7th to 10th or whatever. And then you might play one copy, but you won't be super happy to play like multiples if you have to play multiples. Next up, we have Inferno Helion. This card's going to be pretty bad. It kills itself when you play it, and it can't like attack immediately. So you play it on turn 4, and then you like can trade it for something, but then it kills itself. So it's not going to be a great card, I don't think. It can just take the 7 damage, and then it kills itself, and you're so far behind on board. So I don't think you're going to want to play Inferno Helion. Though, yeah, I think I'm going to start off with this card being unplayable. Lathliss Dragon Queen is going to be a great card. It's just a 6-mana 6/6 flyer that can pump itself. So it can kill them in like one turn usually because it can hit for like 10 damage. I'm going to start off pretty high on this card because it's a 6-mana 6/6 flyer, which is huge. The other ability for other dragons isn't super relevant. Though if you have a Dragon Egg in play, that's kind of cool. Does Dragon Egg have Dragon type? Yeah, Dragon Egg is a Dragon Egg type. I don't know if that counts, but either way, you can usually win the game if you play a Lathliss. It's like a fine curve topper for an aggressive deck, though you might not want to go up to 6 mana in an aggressive deck. And then in a control deck, it just like is so huge, it just has to be killed immediately or your opponent loses. Lava Axe is pretty unplayable. It doesn't deal with creatures, so 5 mana to deal 5 to the opponent just doesn't do enough if you fall behind. So I don't think Lava Axe is going to be particularly playable. Lightning Mare, I think it's going to be fine. 2 mana 3/1 is kind of nice. Is like decent stats, like not great. They're like the white version of that wasn't very good. Being able to pump itself is quite good though. I think this card's going to be much worse than the other mares. All the other mares have been pretty good so far. The Lightning Mare is definitely the worst one we've seen, and I think it's going to be not a card you have to prioritize, especially because double red is really hard to do on turn 2. So I think it's going to be like a middle of the pack type card, probably like middle to low end of the pack. The ability is kind of nice. And not being able to be blocked by blue creatures means you might side it in certain matchups. But I think it's, or like if you aren't main decking it. But I think you're going to not really prioritize this card. You'll get it later in the draft because nobody really wants it. Lightning Strike, however, is great. Efficient removal. Take it every time. Take it early, play it every time. Onake Ogre, 3 mana 4/2 is like a high power for 3 mana. So you can play it in certain decks if you are aggressive. It's also a fine blocker. So I think Onake Ogre is just going to be fine, a medium level card. Sarkhan Fireblood. 3 mana Planeswalkers are generally good in Limited. It does filter you a lot, and adding 2 mana only to cast dragon spells is pretty irrelevant. So I think you only want this if you're like a dedicated control deck, and even then, I don't think it's going to be great. the filter ability is pretty relevant, but like the discard draw card part, and if you're in a control mirror and you're able to protect it and tick it up to ultimate, then that's nice. But you're not usually going to have enough dragons for it to matter. So this is more of a constructed plan. I wouldn't start off by taking this card highly like the Ajani. The Ajani is a card I would take highly. Sarkhan's not. He just doesn't affect the board in a meaningful way, even though he is only 3 mana. Sarkhan's Unsealing is kind of tricky to rate. You have to have expensive creatures in your deck, but if you do, then it really pays you off. So like you take a turn off, and then every one of your creatures after that would like become Flame Tongue Kavu in theory. So I think that this card is going to be a card that I will take early in the format. I'm going to prioritize it and take it early, and see how it goes. But I think having a lot of creatures with power 4, 5, or 6 is going to be kind of tricky. Though if you take Sarkhan's Unsealing early, you can prioritize cards like the Onake Ogre and other cards that have high power. So I think in summary, Sarkhan's Unsealing is going to be a bit of a build-around card, but if you can get it early in the draft, I think it's worth building around. So I think I would take it like pack one, pick one over a lot of cards, just so I can build around it and have it be great. Shock, I have as the number 1 red common. It's just efficient removal, and it's very strong for what it does. Like, you can double spell with it a lot of the time. You can play it on turn 1 to gain some tempo, like if you're on the draw. And I think Shock is just great, and it can even target the opponent's face if you're a super aggressive deck and you get them low. So Shock is great. I'm going to start with it as the number 1 common, though if the 2 damage ends up being kind of irrelevant, Electrify could definitely replace it. Next up, we have Siege Breaker Giant. For 5 mana as a 6/3, it's pretty great, especially because it has Trample. I think this card's going to be very good in the format, especially because making stuff unable to block is very scary. So I'm going to start off very high on this card and then move down. It does cost 5 mana, so you don't want too many 5-drops, but this is a very good 5-drop. It's got a ton of power, it's very hard to chump block, and making stuff unable to block lets your other creatures get through. Smelt is going to be unplayable. Spark Tongue Dragon is going to be great. 5 mana 3/3 is not like the best, but if you can like get up to 8 mana, it's got upside, so I think it's going to be like a pretty high pick if you have like any ramp elements in your deck, but I don't know. The card, maybe I'm a bit too high on the card. Yeah, I'll go down a little bit. I'm going to say that this card's like a medium to high pick because 5 mana 3/3 flyer is still good, and the ability is sometimes relevant. Like if you get to the late game, it's like having extra upside and being able to deal 3. You can deal 3 damage to the opponent. You can deal 3 damage to their creatures. It's pretty good. Split Flame, I'm going to start as a very high pick. 3 mana deal 4 damage to a creature is very good, and then you can prioritize some dragons if you do pick up a Split Flame like the Spark Tongue Dragon. Sure Strike, another one of the 2 mana combat tricks I was talking about. This one's going to be fine. It's the type of combat trick that you usually kill the creature you're fighting in the combat. There's not going to be many times where you play this and the creature you're trying to fight won't die. So I think Sure Strike's going to be pretty fine, like a medium level combat trick. You get it towards the middle. Whenever I say medium level combat trick, I mean you get it in the middle of the pack or middle to low end of the pack, because you don't need to prioritize combat tricks the way you do good creatures and removal spells, because you only need 1 or 2 combat tricks in a deck for it to really function, whereas you need a ton of good creatures and a decent amount of removal. Tectonic Rift is going to be unplayable, I think. Thud is going to be unplayable. I think the reason that cards like Fling are good is because they're or playable sometimes is because they're at instant speed, so you can sack your creature in response and get like trade instead of losing. You get to like use your creature for value in a different way. So your Fling, like here, you're just 2 for 1ing yourself, which is usually not going to be worth it. Tormenting Voice spins your wheels a little bit. I don't think it's going to be very good. I'm going to start off with the card being like unplayable. Though if there's an instant or sorceries deck if there's a deck where instants and sorceries matter, Tormenting Voice could be a key part. And if the format's a bit slower, then it could be decent. But I'm going to start off with the card being too much of a spin your wheels card. Trumpet Blast is another card that rewards you for going wide. It's much worse. I think it's worse than Inspire Charge, just because Inspire Charge you can sometimes use on defense in a pinch, whereas Trumpet Blast only affects attackers. It doesn't buff toughness at all. So I'm going to start off with Trumpet Blast being like a build-around card that you don't prioritize in like the first pack. And then in the second pack and third pack, if you have a go wide deck, you could play a Trumpet Blast, but you probably don't want a ton of like too many Trumpet Blasts. Vioshana Pyromancer I have as the number 4 red common. It's just a 2 mana 2/1, but it is essentially like comes in and dealing 2 damage is essentially like stapling on a free like attack from the Pyromancer. Like I think it's going to be pretty good. Like on turn 2, you play this, put them down to 18, then you can attack them down to 16 presumably, or it trades with one of their creatures. And then late in the game, when you're like stalling out as a red aggro deck, You play if you have a couple Pyromancers in your deck, you have some live draws that'll definitely get in for some damage. I also think it's kind of nice with like Inspired Charge type decks because you can like whittle them down a little bit, and then it's just a creature sitting on the battlefield for your Inspired Charge or your Trumpet Blast. Next up, we have Volcanic Dragon. 6 mana, 4/4 haste flying is pretty good, but it is a 6-drop, so you don't need too many of these. I would start off with this card being pretty good. I think I'd have it as a like the card that you take like around like 4th or 5th in the draft and be pretty fine with that. But I don't think you want to take it over like Efficient Removal. I think I would maybe take the first Volcanic Dragon over the Viashana Pyromancer, and then I'd take other Pyromancers over the Dragon, just because Pyromancer definitely gets better in multiples. Next up, we have Volley Veteran. The final red card is an uncommon. I think it's like a cool build around for goblins. It's cool with Goblin Instigator because if you play Goblin Instigator, you have 2 goblins already, and then there's a pretty decent amount of goblins. So I think you can build around Volley Veteran. I don't think I would take it highly in draft goblins. I think if I had goblins, I would take the Volley Veteran. That's it. In worst case scenario, it deals 1 damage. So I think I would take it like, I wouldn't like first pick Volley Veteran, but I would like take it like 3rd if I was already if I knew I was going to be red. I would take like Volley Veteran 3rd, and or even though I didn't know, like in pack 1, pick one. Like in pack 1, I would take like Volley Veteran like 3rd and be pretty fine with that, knowing that I'd pick up a couple goblins. And even worst case scenario, it does ping. It only targets creatures because otherwise you could like fireball your opponents sometimes. But I think it's still going to be pretty good, and you would prioritize Goblin Instigators a little higher once you had Volley Veteran. So yeah, I think the card's going to be pretty good. Another reason to not leave your creatures on 1 toughness in this format. Next up, we are going to move on to green. First up, we have Blanchwood Armor. This card, I don't think is going to be good just because you're not going to be able to like play a deck that has 11 forests a lot of the time. And Blanchwood Armor like really goes downhill. If you're paying 3 mana to give your creature like +2/+2, like it's just not great. Later in the game, you play it and you give your creature like +4/+4, which is fine. But I don't think the cost of opening yourself up for a 2-for-1 is worth Blanchwood Armor. So I'm going to start off with the card being pretty unplayable. Bristling Boar can't be blocked by more than 1 creature is kind of a weird line of text. It like takes you a second to wrap your head around just what that means. But essentially, like it's going to trade with their 3/2 or their 3/1 or their 3/3 a lot of the time. They can't double block it, but it's only a 4/3 for 4. So by that time, they're going to probably have a creature that can single block it. So it'll be fine. Like I would take it in the middle of the pack. I'd probably play a couple copies of it. It is still a 4-powered 4-drop, but in the end, it's not a super crazy card. Centaur Courser, I have as the number 4 common. I think that people are going to underrate this card. They're going to be like, it's just a 3-mana 3/3. But the thing is that a 3-mana 3/3 is a great card. It blocks pretty much every 2-drop, and it attacks very well. It's just a good, efficient creature, and I think it's going to be worth a lot. I think people are not going to take Centaur Courser when they should, because I think they're not going to value the 3/3 body. They're going to see it doesn't have any abilities, and they're going to underrate it. But I think Centaur Courser is quite good. Number 5, next we have Colossal Dreadmaw. He's back again. Notably, he has the Ixalan flavor text, which I don't think is significant, but I just wanted to point that out. I think it's kind of funny. They have printed this card a lot recently, so I'm sure you know what it does if you've been playing in recent sets. But this card is going to be good. I have it as a number 5 green common. It's a great payoff at the common level for doing things that green wants to be doing, like ramping. And giving it trample means it's hard to chump block, and 6/6 for 6 is just a fine body. So I think Colossal Dreadmaw is going to be a card that you pick in like the middle of the pack, and then like it gives you a good payoff for ramping like you want to definitely have payoffs if you're going to be ramping, and Colossal Dreadmaw is a good one. Next up, we have Colossal Majesty. This card's tough to rate because if you control a creature with power 4 or greater as you start your turn, then you're probably in a decent spot a lot of the time because it means that they didn't like kill it or balance it, and you're like surviving. I don't think the card. I'm going to start off pretty low on Colossal Majesty. I'm going to say that this card is not playable just because it doesn't do anything on turn 3, and even like the turn after that, if you like on turn 3, you're not going to have a 4-powered creature. On turn 4, you play a 4-powered creature. Then on turn 5, you finally draw 1 card from the card you spent your turn playing on turn 3. So I don't think it's going to be very good. But if the format ends up slower and in board stalls where you have huge creatures in play, then it could be good. But I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm going to start off with it being unplayable. Daggerback Basilisk, I think it's going to be good. 3-mana 2/2, 3-mana 2/2 is not a great efficient attacker, but it's a great blocker. And Death Touch is a very good ability in Limited because it means that like no matter what, you're going to be trading with their guy. And even though it's a 3-mana 2/2, it can trade with their 6-drop, it can trade with anything. So I think Daggerback Basilisk is going to be quite good. Maybe it should be the number 5 green common instead of Colossal Dreadmaw. But if you are getting beaten down, it'll trade with anything. So I think it's going to be quite good. And it's just not a very good aggressive card. I mean, even then, it's a fine aggressive card. It trades with their 2-drop a lot of the time if you're attacking with it. So you kind of really only want it in a defensive deck. Declare Dominance is kind of a nice lure effect, but I still think it's going to be pretty bad because you're going to give your creature +3/+3. All their guys are going to block it, and like if your creature's huge, they wouldn't normally want to block it with all their guys, I guess. But I think it's kind of a risky type card. Like you have to have a big creature already. Like if you played on a Colossal Dreadmaw, you'll eat their whole board, which is good. But if you played on like a 3/3, they'll triple block it and kill their guy, and you get a little bit of value. But the card is completely unplayable unless you have a creature and you want to be able to attack. So like if you're getting beaten down, they don't have any blockers back. So I'm going to start off with Declare Dominance being pretty bad. Like I would play it in a deck that was ramping heavily and had like a couple Colossal Dreadmaws. I think I would play it just to see how it did. But I think the card is going to be pretty bad in general. Next up, we have Druid of the Horns. I think people are going to play a lot of bad auras to justify this card. But I don't think you should be playing this card. I don't think the auras are good enough in this set to justify playing them. And I don't think Druid of the Horns is like the payoff you need to play bad auras. So I don't think you should be playing this card. I think it's going to be unplayable. Druid of the Cowl I have as the number 2 green common. Ramp is going to be good in green, I think. There's a lot of kind of fatties that you can ramp out. And it's a long way from Llanowar Elves in terms of power level, but I still think it's going to be good. And you should take it like pretty early if you are going to be a green deck. Dryad Dreamseeker is kind of nice value. Just 2 mana 1/3 is not a great body, but it has the upside of drawing you like a card some amount of the time. Like if you just and drawing lands is going to be good. It just draws you a card some portion of the time, which is pretty good. And it gives you information about what you're drawing on your future turns. Elvish Clan Callers, not going to be great in limited. There's not a ton of elves, and 2 mana 1/1s aren't pretty good and aren't really good. And you're not going to have a ton of you're not going to have multiple clan callers. So I think this card's more of a constructed plant than a limited card. So if you have enough elves, you could consider playing it. Like if you have 5 or 6 elves, you could definitely play it. Probably like 6 elves is the minimum. Elvish Rejuvenator, I like how it synergizes with the enters play tap dual lands, because it doesn't say a basic land. You can just put a land card from among them onto the battlefield. So it is a nice little ramp spell that can fix your mana. So I think Elvish Rejuvenator is going to be quite good, especially because it lets you play like your splashes a lot easier because you can find them with your Elvish Rejuvenators, and you can ramp and play your expensive cards sooner. So I think Elvish Rejuvenator is going to be quite good. A little bit behind Druid of the Cowl because it is a little bit slower, but if you have splash color, like a splash color and a couple of the dual lands, I could definitely see taking Rejuvenator over Druid in certain decks. Next up, we have Ghastbark Twins, 7 mana, 7/7 trample. That is pretty good the turn it comes in at blocking. So it's a pretty good blocker. I think this card's going to be better in green than it would be in other colors because 7 mana is a lot, but green has a lot of ramp. So I think the fact that green has a lot of ramp is going to make Ghastbark Twins much better than it would be in a lot of other colors. Though it's still 7 mana, and even though it's a fine blocker, if they have like a bounce spell, you lose pretty much if you just tap out for this. So, or if they have like a Luminous Bonds, there are definitely ways to kill Ghastbark Twins very efficiently. So I wouldn't prioritize this card, but I wouldn't mind playing like one copy in a green deck with a lot of ramp. Girapur Guide, however, is a great card. 3 mana 3/2 is not horrific, and then the ability is incredibly relevant later in the game when you're trying to force through those last points of damage or in a board stall. It just makes your creatures like very difficult to chump block. And if you have like a Dreadmaw, they can't like triple block it. They have to like block with their bigger guys. So I think Girapur Guide is going to be a pretty high priority pick, and I think it's going to be very good. Giant Spider, it's going to be better or worse depending on how good flyers are in this format. I haven't seen a ton of great flyers. Like there was a couple in white, there was a couple in blue that were like fine, but Giant Spider should shut down most of those. But I don't know how good flying decks are going to be because I think the ground decks are going to be pretty. Like the aggressive ground creature decks are going to be good. So I think you're not going to necessarily need the ground wall flyers specifically, brick wall flyers specifically, but Giant Spider is a fine defensive body, so it's going to be like a medium level pick that you can play in most of your green decks and not be embarrassed. Gift of Paradise is a nice one for splashing. It also gains you some life, which is pretty relevant, and it ramps you. So I think Gift of Paradise is going to be a pretty high pick. It does facilitate splashes quite well, so I would be pretty fine picking it fairly early. A lot of the time you want to have a good card to splash with it before you take it, because you do want to make use of the effect that it can add mana of any color. But I think it's going to be a great card that you can take early and then find a splash card, or you can take you can splash more aggressively if you have a Gift of Paradise, is what I'm trying to say. Gigantosaurus I don't think is going to be great. 5 green symbols is very hard to do in limited, because you have to be like mono green. But if you're mono green, you can play Gigantosaurus. I guess that's the payoff. But the 5-mana 10/10 dies to like Luminous Bonds and like 5-mana removal in black. So I think Gigantosaurus is going to be pretty bad. I would not take it early. I wouldn't play it in most of my decks. Goreclaw is going to be pretty good, I think, though. 4-mana, like 4/3, that makes your Colossal Dreadmaws cost 2 less is just going to be great. And giving your other big creatures trample if they don't already have trample is nice when it attacks. So I would take Goreclaw very early, and then I would prioritize expensive cards. If I had Goreclaw, prioritize that and Ramp. Because if you can cast Goreclaw a turn early, then you can cast your other cards a turn early. So you could go like turn 2 Druid of the Cowl, turn 3 Goreclaw, turn 4 Colossal Dreadmaw, and that's like impossible to beat pretty much. Greenwood Sentinel is not insane. 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance. Like Vigilance isn't like necessary on a 2/2 because you attack with it. They can either trade with it or it just dies to their 3/3 or whatever. So Vigilance is not incredible on this type of card. I can see people playing like Greenwood Sentinel into Aura and that being kind of annoying, but I still don't think Greenwood Sentinel is going to be great. Just a 2-mana 2/2. If 2-mana 2/2s are good, Greenwood Sentinel is going to be good. But I'm going to start off with just being a like middle to low end pick. Highland Game, 2-mana 2/1. When it dies, you gain 2 life. I think that's going to be better than the Sentinel because the 2 life is actually kind of relevant compared to Vigilance, even though it does have 1 toughness. So it depends on how punished you are for playing 1 toughness creatures in this format. But I think Highland Game is going to be fine, like mid-level pick. Hungering Hydra is going to be pretty great. If you make it like a 5/5, it's going to be pretty like it can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. So as long as it's bigger than everything they have, it's just going to slowly grow and grow and grow, or it'll just be unblockable. So I think Hungering Hydra is going to be a high pick, and you can even splash it, and it'll be good as a splash card. Most Hydras have like double green or X or something like that, but this one's just green X. So I would be pretty happy to splash a Hungering Hydra even. So I would take it very early and then consider splashing it even if I can't play green. Naturalize, I think, is going to be just a sideboard card. Oakenform is an interesting one. If auras are good, Oakenform is going to be good because you can play a 2-drop into Oakenform, then you have like a 5/5 creature, and that's pretty good. So it depends on how good how like much of the removal people are able to have. But I think I would start out with Oakenform being pretty decent, like in a super aggressive deck. It's quite good with Greenwood Sentinel because then you avoid takedown against white decks. So I think I would definitely like if I had and I was looking for 2-drops, then Greenwood Sentinel is a card that I would look to play. But I think I personally am probably not going to play Oakenform a ton early on because auras do open you up for that 2-for-1. But if you get in for a couple hits with Oakenform, then that could just be worth it for you. Though you don't want it in your like ramp decks because your big guys don't already need Oakenform. You would rather have it in like a beatdown deck that doesn't have a ton of ramp in it. Next up, we have Palaka Worm, a great finisher for green because gaining 7 life when it comes in means that it's going to help stabilize you even if they kill it and they can't really like bounce it or anything. And like even if they and when it dies, drawing a card means that you can find your next big finisher. So I think Palaka Worm is a pretty nice finisher. It does cost 7 mana and it's triple green, so it's a pretty heavy commitment to ramping a little bit because you can't just cast 7 drops normally. But I think it's going to be worth it. I think I would take this card like not first because it is so expensive, but I would take it like pretty highly, like first couple picks in the draft. And then try to build around it. Plummet is going to be a sideboard card for if you struggle with flyers. I wouldn't main deck this card, at least to start. Prodigious Growth I think it's going to be good. Giving any creature +7/+7 in trample just makes them a monster. So I think Prodigious Growth is going to be a great card. I would probably take this first and then play it. I would take it over pretty much every common and uncommon, I think. Just giving any creature +7/+7 in trample is just so big that it makes it like you just win the game by surprise attacking someone with this card. It essentially gives the 7/7 haste because the creature's already on the battlefield when you cast this. So that's why this compared to other auras, I mean, it's the same thing with other auras, but like a 6-mana 7/7 trample would be good. And then you essentially give it haste. So 6-mana 7/7 trample haste. Even if they kill your creature, you still got in like a hit for 10 or something. So it's still going to be great. Rabid Bite I have as the number 1 green common. It's not a fight spell. It's a spell that does damage from your creature to their creature, so it's just going to be good removal. If you have like a 3/2, you can kill their 3/3, and your guy doesn't die. So I think Rabid Bite's going to be pretty good. If you have Rabid Bites in your deck, you don't want to trade off your creatures as much, though, so be wary of that. Reclamation Sage is going to be a good sideboard card, but you won't main deck this card. Recollect, so you don't have to take it that highly. So the spot where I take sideboard cards is usually where I would normally have where there's like a marginal playable for my deck or a good sideboard card. I would usually take the good sideboard card. That's where I would take sideboard cards, like towards the end of the pack. Recollect is going to be unplayable. It just doesn't. It's just, yeah, you can't spend 3 mana to do that. Rock's Oracle is interesting. I don't think it's going to be great just because 4/2 is just such a bad body for 5 mana that I don't think it's going to be insane. But if the format's slower, then the draw card part becomes a lot more relevant. So then it's a lot better. But I'm going to start off with it being pretty unplayable. Root Snare, unplayable card. Fogs are just not playable in limited. Runic Armasaur, 3 mana 2/5 is pretty good. A pretty good blocker. There's not a ton of abilities on creatures or lands, but in this format. But yeah, 3 mana 2/5 body is a nice defensive card. So in a defensive deck that was heavy green, I would probably play Armasaur. I wouldn't prioritize taking it though. I would be happy to get it towards the end of the pack. I would take most good commons. I would take most good commons over it, I think. Scapeshift is just a constructed plant, not playable in limited. Talons of Wildwood is pretty bad. 2 mana to give +1/+1 and trample is not great. Even if you can return it, just think about it as if it was an equipment that cost 5 to equip. Because that's how much it is. You return it from your graveyard for 3, and then you pay 2 more to equip it. It gives +1/+1 and trample. That's just so bad. So it's not. I'm going to start with this card being unplayable. Thorn Lieutenant is good. It's a 2 mana 2/3, which is already great. It can't be targeted by removal efficiently, which is also great. And then it gets +4/+4 late in the game, so that's also great. So I would start off taking this over pretty much everything. It's just a very efficient card. Thornhead Wolves, decent common, playable but not exceptional. 4 mana 4, 5 mana 4/5 is just meh. So I think this card is going to be like a card you play, but you aren't like super hyped to play it. You can take it towards the middle or the end of the pack. Titanic Growth, another 2 mana combat trick. +4/+4 is huge. So I think this card's going to be a good combat trick, probably mid level. Take it in the middle of the pack. Vigilant Baloth is going to be great. 5 mana 5/5 Vigilance is just a great body because you can start chipping in for damage, make them deal with it, and then it can still block. So I think Vigilant Baloth is a high pick for green. Take it early, play it often. Vine Mare is very annoying. If you have a Vine Mare, you can play like what's it called? Oakide? Oaken form. You can play an Oaken form no problem and if you have a Vine Mare in your deck. Because if you ever go Vine Mare into Oaken form, it's like a 8/6 hexproof. And then if you ever play against a black deck, like what are they going to do? They can't block it with half their creatures. It's just absurd. Vine Mare is not a fair card to have, like not a fun card to have in the format, I don't think. Hexproof is kind of annoying. Vivian Reed is a pretty good planeswalker. Her +1 is draw a card, bring her up to 6 loyalty, and then like her -3 isn't insane, but if you can protect her, she's going to draw you a card every turn with some selection, so you can usually find creatures that can protect her. So I would take Vivian Reed very highly and play her every time. 6 loyalty is a lot. It means that even if you are a little bit behind on board, she won't die to them alpha striking her. Vivian's Invocation, however, is a little bit riskier. 7 cards is not a ton, and if you find a 3/3 with this, it's not going to be great. So I'm going to start off with Vivian's Invocation being pretty unplayable because if you have that many expensive cards, you'll probably don't need Vivian's Invocation to go find them. You'd rather just play one of them rather than spin the dice, though maybe it ends up being better. If the format's slower, it'll be better because you'll be able to survive the bad swings a little bit better. But it's not really a good removal spell because it's so random. And then Wall of Vines is pretty unplayable, I think. Having no power on a defender is really rough because eventually their stuff is just going to be bigger than it. And yeah, that is going to do it for green. Now we're on to the multicolor cards. There's not a ton of these, and we're going to do multicolor/colorless altogether. There's no common multicolored cards, so keep that in mind. Aerial Engineer, another payoff for artifacts, the non-existent artifacts, it would seem. 4 mana 4/4 flyer is great, but if you don't have enough artifacts, 4 mana 2/4 is not great. So I would start off by not prioritizing this card, and I would only take it once I had 5 or 6 artifacts, which is going to be hard to do, I think, because a lot of the artifacts are bad. Arcades the Strategist is the worst of the dragons for limited, I think. 4 mana 3/5 Vigilance is not really worth splashing, usually. And there are some defenders, so if you see Arcades, you could maybe take Arcades and then draft the defenders deck. But the problem is then if they kill Arcades, you pretty much have no way to win. So I'm going to start off with Arcades being kind of junky and limited, not great. The 4 mana 3/5 Flying Vigilance is a nice card if you can splash that color. But I don't think I would prioritize the defender bit all that much, and I don't think the card's going to be as good as the other dragons are. I think I would probably take, at some point I would like to, if I opened an Arcades, I would probably try to draft the defender deck just because it seems like fun. But I don't think the card's like the type of card that you'd take early. I think you don't really prioritize this card because splashing is a huge cost, and even if there are the dual lands, and I just don't think Arcades is worth splashing. Brawl Bash Ogre, 4 mana, 3/3 menace is pretty good, and then being able to sack another creature to get +2/+2 is kind of nice. It makes it into a way to turn your like smaller creatures, like your Goblin Instigator tokens, into like extra damage once you couldn't attack. And 5-power menace is a pretty big deal. So I think Brawl Bash Ogre is the type of card that once I was black-red, I would take it over a lot of the cards, but I wouldn't go into black-red specifically for it. Chromium the Mutable is going to be good. I think if you can get to 7 mana, like if you're playing a good control deck, then Chromium is going to be good. But you have to be able to get to 7 mana. So it's worth splashing in that sense if you're a control deck. Flash means that you're going to eat their creature a lot of the time. They're not going to play around the mythic rare, so you're going to eat their big creature. And then you do have to, it can chip in some points. It can hit them for 7 in the air with flying, and then it's pretty immune to removal. The one important thing to note is if they have like a 7/7, if you're blocking with Chromium and they try, that's like when it's most vulnerable. So you don't necessarily want to block with it all that much, because if you block with it and they have an instant speed removal effect or an instant speed like pump spell for their guy, then you can't give your guy hexproof to protect your guy. So keep that in mind with your Chromium, but Chromium's pretty good, and I think it's worth splashing. I would take it early and then try to draft a control deck to support it, because it's a great finisher, hard to deal with. Draconic Disciple, I think, is a great card. Add 3 mana 2/2 that can add mana of any color is a great card, especially if you're trying to splash. And then the 7 mana ability is quite relevant. So I think Draconic Disciple is going to be a good pickup if you are red-green. You're not going to splash Draconic Disciple. You're going to use Draconic Disciple to splash other colors. So if you're playing like red-green and you're like splashing blue, say, Draconic Disciple is going to be a very high pickup. And even if you're not splashing, it's still going to be a great card. Once you're red-green, I would take this card very highly. But I wouldn't take it like early and then try to draft red-green, I don't think. It depends. It's very subjective. That's why I'm not like hardcore giving grades on every card, because it all depends on what you're like choosing it between, because it is quite a strong card if you're red-green, and it kind of makes you want to play red-green, but at the same time, if you can't end up in red-green, then you can't end up in red-green. Enigma Drake, I didn't see a ton of support for the Spells Matter archetype in this format, but Enigma Drake, if you can get several of those, then you might run some clunky spells just to enable your Enigma Drakes. I just don't think the card's going to be insane, so I'm going to start off by not prioritizing it, but it could be good in some decks. I wouldn't prioritize it though. Take it like late in the pack if you're like, take it if your deck is good for it, but don't take it early and try to build a deck around it. That's been a theme I've seen with a lot of these build around cards, is they're more the type of card that you have the shell for them already set up. They aren't as good as if you like take them early and then build around them. Heroic Reinforcements is the gold card for the red-white go-wide archetype. The archetype that is kind of supported at the common slot by a couple of there's a creature in each color that's good for it, and then it's got a ton of mass pump spells. And this creates 2 tokens, and they get +1/+1 and haste. So this is it creates 2/2/2 haste creatures, and then the 1/1s stick around for your inspired charge turn later potentially. Giving your creature's haste means it's like 4 damage out of nowhere sometimes. So I think the card's going to be pretty good in the red-white go-wide archetype. But if you're not going wide, then it's not going to be as good. NicolaiBolas the Ravager is absurd. 4 mana 4/4 flyer is great. And then if you ever flip it, you pretty much just win the game. So I would take NicolaiBolas the Ravager over everything, pack one, pick one, and definitely try to play it if I can. Palladium Moors, very similar. If it's 6 mana 6/6, that's definitely going to block at least once or attack at least once. So Palladium Moors is great. I would take it over everything once again. It is a little bit expensive at 6 mana, but I think it's definitely worth splashing, even though it's 3 colors. I don't think splashing is going to be a huge downside. You can definitely prioritize the dual lands a little bit more because they are at the common slot, and there is Manolith in this format. So I think it's going to be pretty easy to splash. Poison Tipped Archer is a nice card. It's always going to trade on defense. It's a pretty good blocker. And each opponent losing life whenever a creature dies, it's another creature. It's not even just a creature. It's not just creatures you control. So I think Poison Tip Archer is once again going to be a card that you don't want to splash, because I don't think it's worth hurting your mana base. But it is going to be great in black-green. So if you're black-green, you take it over a lot of things, like not removal, but over a lot of other things. And then outside of that, it's not going to be a card that you take a ton, but it's going to be a great blocker. Especially so if you're controlling like a defensive black-green deck, it's going to be great. Psychic Symbiont is a built-in like 3-for-1. You get a creature, they discard a card, you draw a card for 6 mana. So if you can afford to play a 6-drop like I think this card's gonna be great. I would take this card. I would splash this card. I think it's like one of the best uncommons in the set, and I think it's just very strong. Regal Bloodlord, I think, is not as good. I don't think there's gonna be as much life gain. So 4 mana 2, like 5 mana 2/4 flyer is not a great rate, and then you're not gonna be getting a ton of bats. So I'm not gonna prioritize this card early. If you are white-black and you have like 5 or 6 ways to gain life, especially repeatable life gain, then I might play the Bloodlord, but I don't think it's going to be good. I wouldn't splash it or anything like that. Satyr Enchanter is, I think, a trap card. People are going to have a Satyr Enchanter and be like, oh, I'll play all my auras now. They're going to cantrip. But in reality, it's going to be pretty bad because it'll make you play bad cards. And like it's a 3 mana 2/2 for when things don't go well, so I don't think it's going to be great. I'm not going to play this card all that much, and I don't think you should take it highly or even play it. Even if you are green-white, I don't think you should play it. Skyrider Patrol, however, is great. 4 mana 2/3 flyer is not like the biggest body, but the fact that you can like pump a creature and give it flying makes it a great attacker. And you don't even have to attack with your Skyrider Patrol. You can like just make a creature get +1/+1 if you can't even afford to attack with it. So pretty great. Then we have Vivictus Asmati, the Dire. Another card that I'd be happy to splash. The thing is, it does target permanents both players control, but you can like start targeting your lands and start flipping up things, and you can kill their biggest creature. So Vivictus is going to be great, and take it early, splash it. It's going to be great. Now we are on to the artifact section. This is where I was talking about there not being a ton of great artifacts, especially at the common slot. Amulet of Safekeeping is unplayable and limited. It just doesn't do anything. They don't target you with their stuff, and they don't have a ton of tokens, so Amulet's unplayable. Arcane Encyclopedia, if the format ends up a little bit slower or you can afford to draft a controlling deck, Arcane Encyclopedia is a great win con at the uncommon slot because 3 mana tap to draw a card is pretty reasonable. So I think the Arcane Encyclopedia is going to be a payoff for a control deck, and I would take it pretty highly. If I would take it, I wouldn't take it over like the best commons because I think that there are definitely going to be assertive decks in this format, like aggressive decks that are pretty good. But if I am planning on drafting a control deck for whatever reason, Arcane Encyclopedia is the type of card that I want. So if you're a control deck, you really want it. Chaos Wand is a card that I wouldn't play unless I saw unless there was in a control mirror, and then I might side it in because it is like drawing a card kind of. But your opponent has to have good instants and sorceries to work with it, and there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case, and it costs 7 mana to use. So I wouldn't pick this highly. I would pick it up like towards the end of the pack and then side it in against controlling decks if I was a control deck myself. Crucible of Worlds is unplayable and limited, but it's a sick reprint. Desecrated Tomb is unplayable and limited, but I don't know what it's going to be used for constructed, but it's unplayable and limited. Diamond Mare, if you need an artifact, it's not embarrassing to play a Diamond Mare. 2 mana 1/3 is not great. The life gain could be relevant if you end up in a life gain matters type deck. So the black-white deck, maybe you play a Diamond Mare for that repeatable life gain. But I'm not going to start out prioritizing it. I think it's like a card you get towards the end of the pack, and then you sometimes play it, and it's sometimes fine. If you have life gain synergies, then you might prioritize it a little bit higher. It's also a fine blocker. Dragon's Horde is going to be a good card, I think. 3 mana. It's like a manalith, but it has random upside if you have dragons. So it's not a high pick, but if you have a couple dragons, then you pick it a little bit higher, and then it can sometimes draw you some cards. I think it's more of a constructed card than anything, but it's a fine card. It's like you take it at the same time you take a Manalith, which is like in the middle of the pack if you're planning on splashing. So that's pretty much where I'd take Dragon Sword, but I would take it a little bit higher if I had like 2 dragons. Explosive Apparatus is just colorless removal, but it's really inefficient, so I wouldn't prioritize this unless I had like some artifact synergy, in which case it's not embarrassing to play Explosive Apparatus, but it's still not great. So not a high priority. Take it like end of the pack, 7th through 10th or something like that. Field Creeper, 2 mana 2/1 artifact. It's only going to be good if artifact matters in your deck, and even then it's still going to be pretty bad because 2 mana 2/1 with no abilities is pretty horrific. So I'm going to start off by saying Field Creeper is pretty much unplayable. That's what I said when I said there was 3 artifact creatures, like 3 artifact creatures at the common slot. Like Field Creeper is one of them. So like that's why it's going to be hard to get artifacts that actually are relevant. Fountain of Renewal could be good if your deck really cares about life gain, like with that Vampire Knight guy, the uncommon, and Ajani's Pridemates and stuff. And then it can draw you a card if you really need to. So I think you'll want it in some decks, but most of the time you're never going to play it just because it doesn't do enough for you in most decks. So you really have to care about the life gain trigger. Gargoyle Sentinel, 3 mana 3/3, colorless defender is going to be a card that a lot of decks play, and then being able to gain flying is nice. I think this card is going to be a good deck good card in control decks because you don't care as much about the defender, and by the time you turn the corner, you'll have the 3 mana to spare. But in an aggressive deck, you don't want it. So early on in the draft, I wouldn't prioritize it because you don't know early on in the draft if you're going to end up a control deck or an aggro deck. But once you know whether you're a control deck, if you're a control deck, I would take this card like fairly, like in the middle, like middle to upper range of a pack, because it is still just a 3 mana 3/3, but it is colorless. So it's kind of tricky because early on, drafting colorless cards early is usually good, but since this card's only good in a control deck, it's not even that good to draft it early. So I would like not prioritize it, like middle of the pack for a control deck and not for an aggressive deck. Gearsmith Guardian, if you're playing blue, it is a 5 mana 5/5 if you keep a blue creature around, and it's an artifact. So if you're a blue deck that cares about artifacts, Gearsmith Guardian could be what you want. And it's like the second best creature that's an artifact. So it is 5 mana, so you can't usually like turn on your synergy cards for artifacts, but it's like a fine card. And giving it +2/+2 and indestructible is kind of nice if you're playing white, even if you aren't playing blue. But I don't think this card's going to be a high pick. You'll usually get it if you want it, I think, because nobody else is going to really want it. Magistrate Scepter is unplayable in limited, but it's kind of cool. Just you're never going to take an extra turn with this card. It's too much mana. Manalith is going to be the type of card that if you have a reason to splash, you'll take Manalith. Otherwise, you won't. And when you do take Manalith, you'll probably take it in like the middle of a pack after you would take good removal spells and good creatures. So you'll take it over like medium creatures. Marauder's Axe, I think it's going to be unplayable. It doesn't buff toughness at all, so you're just making your creatures better attacking. It's not great on defense. And it is 4 mana for the first equip. It's not like super efficient, so I don't think this card's going to be very good. Meteor Golem is an interesting one. It's like a 7 mana 3/3 that destroys a creature. Pretty much is what it's going to be in limited most of the time. It is an artifact, which could be relevant, but it's so expensive that unless you're playing a ramp deck, if you're playing a ramp deck, I think you would want this card. But other than that, I don't think you want this card. So I don't think I would take it early because it's so bad in like aggressive decks. That's the thing. Whenever you see an expensive card, you think, or a deck card that's only good in a certain type of deck, you don't really want to take that card early because it's not going to be great. In like half of the decks you play, even if you end up that color. So that's just something to keep in mind. Millstone, not going to be playable in limited. You're not going to be able to mill someone out with that. It's kind of a sweet callback, but I don't think mill's going to be relevant unless you're playing some kind of hyper control mirror where you both have like that enchantment that mills the person every time you draw cards. And I kind of want to see that happen, but it's not going to happen. I don't think Millstone is just too clunky. You're not going to be milling people, especially because you have to like pay mana to do it. Rogue's Gloves is an interesting one. If you have a couple evasive creatures, it could be like decent, but I think I'm going to start off with the card being like very, very like bad, like pretty bad. Because it doesn't help your creature deal damage anyway, and so you're spending 4 mana, not affecting the board really, hoping that your creature gets through for damage and that you don't have removal for you. Because if they have any like sort of removal spell, you just pretty much lose on the spot, and it doesn't even protect you from removal. So I'm going to start off with the Rogue's Glove being unplayable, but if you have enough evasiveness, maybe it like moves up a tiny bit, and I don't think it's going to be good though. It doesn't buff your power or toughness at all. Sigiled Sword of Valoron, however, is great. If you get one hit in with this, it just kind of feeds itself. I would prioritize evasiveness after I had the Sword of Valoron, but I think a lot of decks, like if you can get like a flyer and put that on on the flyer, then you can like start getting a 2/2 every turn, which is really good. So I think this is like an equipment that's kind of like worth it, but so I like would take it early, but I still think I would take, even though it's colorless, I still think I would take premium removal over it, but then I would take the Sword of Valoron over good creatures. Skyscanner is a very key artifact in this set. I have it as the number 2 best artifact, or colorless, or land. Skyscanner is an artifact creature, which is relevant for blue decks to some degree, that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. So 3 mana 1/1, it has evasion, draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. So I think this card's going to be pretty good. It is a bit small for 3 mana because it does draw you the card and have evasion. So it's not great if you are an aggressive deck. It's more for like synergy-driven mid-range decks, which might be a thing, especially in blue, because blue has some cards that care about artifacts. Suspicious Bookcase, I think, is kind of a neat card. 2 mana 0/4 defender is like not a great, like it's not great, but it does block most things, and then it's semi-relevant in the late game. So I think it's the type of card that a control deck could really want. But you don't really have to prioritize Suspicious Bookcase. It's not going to be like your best card. So I think you could take it towards the end of the pack. Nobody else is going to want it, and then you'll play it, and it'll be fine. But I'm not opposed to playing it. And then we have Transmogrifying Wand. I think turning something into a 2/4 creature at sorcery speed is not going to be great. just because 2/4 are still pretty beefy, and you've spent 4 mana, and you can, yeah. I don't think this card's going to be very good. It's essentially a 4 mana card that turns one of their creatures into a 2/4, which is just not going to be good. So I think this card's unplayable. And then our final cards are the lands. We have all of the dual lands. I'm just going to cover it once. You play the dual lands. Take the dual lands over, if you're those 2 colors, take the dual lands over a medium card of the color, like average to below average. You don't take it over the premium creatures. You don't take it over the premium removal spells. And if you really need a curve slot in your curve field, you'll take the curve filler over it. But you take Cinder Barons, you would take Cinder Barons in your black-red deck over most other things, just because it really helps your mana. Make sure you don't get mana flooded. I mean, mana screwed. Really makes sure you do not get mana screwed. So that's the same with Cinder Barons, Sanctuary, Foul Orchard, Highland Lake, Meandering River, Stone Quarry, Submerged Drownyard, Timber Gorge, Tranquil Expanse, and Woodland Stream. And all of those are at the common slot, so you're going to see those a lot in the draft. So you'll probably be able to pick up a couple to help your deck really not struggle with its mana. If you are splashing a color, you ideally would have a land that is one of your main colors and your splash color. So if you're splashing red in your black-white deck, then Cinder Barons is a great card to pick up because it's a source of your main color and of your splash color. So I think the dual lands are going to be high priorities if you do want that, because they're relatively free ways to get extra sources of your splash color. Even if you are black-red splashing white, say, Cinder Barons is still a high priority because it gives you a higher density of black and red sources without making you get rid of, while still giving you, it lets you play an extra planes while still having the same number of black and red sources. Next up we have Detection Tower. I'm just not going to cover all of the dual lands because they're all the same. 1 second. Detection Tower is not going to be playable in Limited. It's just a colorless land. Reliquary Tower is not going to be playable either. And then Rupture Spire, because it's a colorless land, you're never going to go over your max hand size. I mean, for this one, Hexproof isn't relevant, so you're not going to play that card ever. It just hurts your mana base too much for no upside. And then Rupture Spire is the type of card that you'll play if you're playing like 3 colors. It's a decent way to fix your mana. And that is going to do it for the Core Set 2019 set review. I really hope you enjoyed it and gained some value from it. If you have any questions about a specific card that you would like me to go into more detail on, be sure to let me know in the comments section down below, and I will be happy to do so. Also, let me know how your pre-releases go, how your first drafts go. If you have any other feedback, please let me know. And be sure to click that thumbs up, subscribe, and share the videos with your friends if you think it would be helpful to them. But yeah, that is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.